The thing about galactic warfare that nobody mentions in the recruitment videos is how absolutely tedious losing actually is. Not the dying part, mind you. That happens quickly enough. All flash-burnt flesh and vacuum-frozen eyeball. No. The tedious bit is watching it happen in slow motion across 57 star systems over the course of 8 years. Each defeat so predictable you could set your chronometer by it. The Yverath Dominion had been grinding humanity into cosmic dust with the kind of methodical efficiency that suggested they found the whole affair rather boring. They were apex predators, evolutionarily speaking. 4 meters of scaled muscle, redundant organ systems, and the kind of casual brutality that came from spending 3 million years at the top of their food chain. They didn't hate humans. That would have required considering humanity worthy of emotional investment. They simply removed obstacles, and humanity had made the unfortunate mistake of colonizing 17 worlds the Dominion had marked for expansion. The war councils called it a conflict. The survivors called it extermination with paperwork. By the time Command pulled her into that sterile briefing room on Europa Station, humanity was down to 9 colonies and 1 very tired homeworld. She'd watched the others fall through tactical displays and casualty reports, each one a careful arrangement of statistics that translated to billions of deaths. Her own family had been on New Valletta. The Yverath had orbital bombarded it down to bedrock 3 years ago. No strategic value to the attack, really. Just thorough. The colonel who briefed her had the look of a man who'd stopped sleeping sometime around the fall of Arcturus Prime, and had decided that was fine. Actually, sleep was for species with a future. He laid out the situation with the kind of clinical detachment that comes from knowing you're describing an apocalypse. "We've run every simulation," he said, fingers drumming against the tactical display. "Every conventional scenario ends with human extinction within 18 months. The Yverath have better ships, better weapons, better everything. They're biologically superior in every measurable way. We can't outfight them." She'd already known this, obviously. Anyone with functioning brain cells and access to casualty reports knew that, but hearing it said aloud in that gray room with its gray walls and gray future felt different. "So we're surrendering?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "We're adapting." The colonel pulled up a file marked with enough security clearances to make a general nervous. "Project Chimera. We've been working on it since the war started. Biological augmentation on a scale that makes previous attempts look like cosmetic surgery. We take a human volunteer, break them down to the genetic level, and rebuild them into something the Yverath have never encountered." The images in the file made her stomach attempt escape velocity. Genetic splicing, neural rewiring, biological weapon integration. They weren't talking about making better soldiers. They were talking about making monsters. "The survival rate for the procedure?" she asked, studying the designs with a scientist's eye. She'd been in xenobiology before the war, back when humanity had the luxury of studying alien life instead of being annihilated by it. 63% make it through the initial transformation. Of those, 40% maintain cognitive function. Of those, we estimate maybe 10% retain enough humanity to follow orders. So, approximately 3% chance of surviving as anything resembling herself. Fantastic odds. Truly inspirational. And if it worked, she zoomed in on the biological specs, noting the predatory adaptations with a clinical fascination that probably said disturbing things about her mental state. "What exactly would I become?" The colonel's smile could have frozen helium. "The thing they have nightmares of." The Yverath conquered their homeworld by being the deadliest thing in their ecosystem. They've never encountered a predator more efficient than themselves. "We're going to change that." The logic was sound, in a horrifying sort of way. Humanity couldn't win through superior firepower or tactic, but terror? Terror was universal. Every species, no matter how advanced, understood the primal fear of being hunted. The Yverath had forgotten what that felt like. The project aimed to remind them. She should have said no. Any rational person would have said no. The procedure would destroy everything she was. Remake her into something that existed solely to kill. Her memories would fracture, her emotions would dull, her humanity would bleed away like water through fingers. She'd become a weapon, aimed and fired, and never quite able to be holstered again. But rationality was a luxury for species that weren't 18 months from extinction. The others who went through this, she said slowly, still studying the biological configurations. The ones who survived. Where are they? Dead. They lasted between 3 weeks and 4 months in combat, before the Yverath killed them. Each one took down impressive numbers before they fell, but they were prototypes. The procedure's been refined since then. You'd be the first of the completed design, so she'd be the experiment that might finally work, or the failure that proved the concept was flawed. Either way, her life as she knew it ended the moment she walked into that medical bay. The colonel waited, patient as extinction. He'd probably delivered this briefing before, watched other volunteers weigh their humanity against humanity's survival. She wondered how many had agreed. How many had walked into that medical bay knowing they'd never walk out as themselves. I want full access to the biological specifications, she said finally. If I'm doing this, I'm going in understanding exactly what I'm becoming. That's not standard protocol. And this is barely standard biology. I was xenobiologist specializing in predatory adaptation, before you people conscripted me into weapons development. If I'm volunteering to become your monster, I want to understand the science. The colonel considered this, then nodded. 72 hours. Review the specs. Make your decision. But understand, once you commit, there's no reversing it. The transformation is permanent. You won't die of old age. Probably. We don't actually know. But you'll never be human again. She'd stopped being fully human the day New Valletta burned. This was just making it official. They gave her the full files. The complete biological breakdown of what Project Chimera would make her. Enhanced musculature derived from Yverath genetics. Neural acceleration borrowed from about 6 different predatory species. Sensory augmentation that would let her track targets through vacuum by heat signature alone. Her body would become a biological factory, capable of synthesizing toxins, pheromones, acids. Her bones would reinforce with metallic compounds. Her skin would toughen into something resembling organic armor. She'd be faster than the Yverath, stronger pound for pound, and utterly relentless. Her consciousness would shift, rewire itself around predatory instincts that had been encoded into the genetic material they'd harvested from a dozen apex predators across known space. She'd think like something that hunted, moved like something designed to kill, existed for the singular purpose of being more lethal than anything else in the galaxy. The psychological profiles from the previous subjects made for grim reading. Progressive detachment from human emotion, increasing difficulty with complex reasoning beyond tactical assessment, gradual loss of linguistic capability. They'd all eventually stop speaking entirely, communicating only through gestures when communication was necessary. One of them had apparently eaten a Yverath warrior alive, which the psychological report noted with clinical concern. She spent her 72 hours memorizing every specification, every projection, every warning. When she walked into that medical bay, she wanted no illusions about what was coming. The medical team treated her with the careful reverence usually reserved for the terminally ill. They were about to kill her. After all, the person walking into this room wouldn't be the person leaving it. They'd destroy her piece by piece, rebuild her into something new, something useful, something capable of making the Yverath Dominion reconsider their extermination schedule. Last chance, the head surgeon said, holding the injection that would begin the cascade. Once we start, we can't stop. You'll be conscious for most of it. The pain will be extraordinary. Good, she said, settling into the restraints. I'd hate to miss my own transformation into humanity's last desperate gamble. The surgeon's expression suggested he didn't appreciate the sarcasm, but he triggered the injection anyway. The pain was, indeed, extraordinary. The human body contains approximately 37 trillion cells, give or take a few billion depending on who's counting. Project Chimera required rewriting every single one of them, which turned out to be exactly as excruciating as basic biology would suggest. She screamed for the first 6 hours. After that, her vocal cords restructured themselves into something capable of producing sounds that made the medical staff deeply uncomfortable. One nurse quit, 2 others requested psychiatric evaluation. The head surgeon just kept monitoring the readouts with the grim determination of a man watching a controlled demolition that might not be entirely controlled. Her bones broke and reformed, reinforced with metallic compounds that her marrow somehow learned to produce. Her muscles tore themselves apart and knitted back together, denser, faster, stronger. Her nervous system caught fire and rebuilt itself with enhanced conductivity that made every sensation feel like touching a live wire. Her brain, that delicate 3-pound lump of electrochemical reactions, got the worst of it. Neural pathways dissolved and reconstructed, pruning away everything unnecessary for hunting and killing, reinforcing everything that was. She felt her personality fragmenting, pieces of herself sliding away like water. Her favorite color didn't matter anymore. Her childhood memories blurred into irrelevant. The poetry she'd loved, the music that had moved her, the philosophical debates she'd enjoyed, all of it compressed down into background noise beneath the growing roar of predatory instinct. What remained was sharp and hungry and entirely focused. The transformation took 11 days. When they finally released the restraints, she stood on legs that didn't quite move like human legs anymore, looked through eyes that processed information her original brain couldn't have handled, and breathed through lungs that extracted oxygen with disturbing efficiency. The medical team backed away. Instinct, probably. They were soft things, fragile and slow, and her new brain helpfully cataloged exactly how she'd kill each one if necessary. Not because she wanted to, just because that information was suddenly available, filed away under useful tactical debt. "How do you feel?" the surgeon asked from a carefully maintained distance. She considered the question, turning it over in a mind that didn't quite work the same way anymore. Feelings were still there, technically, but they'd been compressed, streamlined, stripped of unnecessary complexity. "Functional," she said, and her voice came out wrong, too deep, with harmonics that made the equipment vibrate. The military assessment came next. They put her through tests that would have killed her previous body in minutes. Reaction time, strength, endurance, sensory capability. She broke their equipment, not intentionally, just because the parameters hadn't been designed for something like her. General Frost, who'd inherited command after the previous general's unfortunate encounter with a Yverath assassination team, watched the assessments with the expression of someone who'd ordered a scalpel and received a nuclear warhead. "Can you follow orders?" he asked bluntly. She tilted her head, processing the question through neural pathways that now prioritized threat assessment and kill efficiency. Could she? The human part of her, the fragment that remained, said yes. The predator part, which was rapidly becoming dominant, noted that this male was old, slow, and strategically irrelevant to her primary objective. "If the orders involve killing Yverath," she said, "then yes." Not exactly a ringing endorsement of military discipline, but apparently good enough for their desperate situation. They deployed her to Outpost 17, a contested space station orbiting a gas giant neither side particularly wanted, but both sides refused to concede. The Yverath had taken the eastern sectors. Humanity held the western. The middle sections had become a killing ground where both species fed soldiers into a meat grinder for the tactical value of absolutely nothing. She arrived via stealth pod, entering through a maintenance airlock the Yverath hadn't bothered securing. Why would they? Humans didn't hunt. Humans defended, retreated, died. They didn't infiltrate enemy territory alone. The station's corridors stank of Yverath, all sulfur and ammonia, and the particular scent of apex predators, who'd never learned to fear anything. Her enhanced senses picked apart the smells, categorizing them, counting individuals, tracking movement patterns. 17 warriors in the eastern sector, moving in standard patrol configurations, utterly confident in their superiority. She'd fix that. The first one died without understanding what killed it. She dropped from a ventilation shaft, landed on its back, and tore through the reinforced scales protecting its neck before it could trigger an alarm. The Yverath were tough, certainly, but her new biology had been specifically designed to counter their, where they had redundant organs. She had toxins that targeted multiple systems simultaneously,
Where they had armored scales, she had claws that could pierce composite hull plating. The body went down heavy, 4 meters of dead weight hitting the deck with a satisfying thud. She dragged it into a side corridor and waited. The second warrior came looking for its partner 12 minutes later. Standard protocol. When a patrol member goes silent, send back. It walked past her hiding spot with its weapon ready, scanning for human soldiers, for conventional threats, for anything its species had encountered. In 3 million years of evolutionary dominance, it never thought to look up. She killed it even faster than the first, learning, adapting. Her body processed the experience, refined her technique, made mental notes about Yverath, physiology that would make future kills more efficient. The predator instincts that had been encoded into her genetics sang with pleasure. This was what she'd been built for. This was purpose distilled into its purest form. By the 4th kill, the Yverath realized something was wrong. By the 6th, they were actively afraid. She could smell it on them, sharp and acidic, the fear scent of predators, who'd suddenly remembered they could be prey. They abandoned standard patrol patterns, clustered together in defensive formations, triggered station-wide alerts. None of it helped. She moved through their territory like a ghost constructed from teeth and malice, striking from impossible angles, killing with methodical efficiency, leaving bodies in configurations designed to maximize psychological impact. Not because command had ordered, because her restructured brain understood that fear was a weapon more effective than any gun. The last Yverath in the eastern sector died trying to evacuate through an emergency airlock. She caught it halfway through the exit sequence, pulled it back inside, and made sure its death was slow enough that its biosigns would broadcast terror through the Yverath communication network before finally flatting. When she reported mission completion to General Frost, his expression suggested he wasn't sure whether to promote her or shoot her. 17 confirmed kills in 6 hours, he said slowly. 0 human casualties. The Yverath have abandoned the station entirely. They're calling you something in their language. Our translators are having trouble with it, but the closest approximation is the thing that eats endings. She processed this information without particular emotion. Names didn't matter. Results did. Where's the next deployment? She asked. The general studied her for a long moment, perhaps recognizing that he'd created something he couldn't control, only aim. I'll have your orders within the hour.
The Yverath Dominion had conquered 47 species over the course of their expansion into the galaxy. They developed sophisticated protocols for subjugation, detailed procedures for occupation, comprehensive strategies for breaking the will of inferior lifeforms. What they hadn't developed, because they'd never needed it, was a procedure for being hunted. She became their education in that particular gap. Her second deployment was a military research facility on one of their fortress worlds, the kind of installation they'd considered absolutely secure behind 3 defensive fleets and enough firepower to sterilize a continent. Command sent her in alone, inserted via a debris field that the Yverath scanners had dismissed as battle wreckage. She spent 2 days working her way through their defensive perimeter, moving through spaces too small for their massive bodies, patient in the way that true predators understood patience. The facility housed 63 Yverath researchers and military personnel. She killed them over the course of 18 hours, carefully, methodically, making sure each death was discovered before the next one occurred. The researchers had been developing bioweapons to accelerate humanity's extinction. She found this deeply ironic while systematically dismantling their spinal columns. By hour 12, the survivors had barricaded themselves in the central laboratory, weapons trained on every entrance, monitoring systems scanning for any threat. They'd remembered, finally, that humans had technology too. What they hadn't accounted for was that she'd stopped being entirely human. She came through the waste reclamation system, a route they dismissed because nothing living could survive the caustic chemicals flowing through those pipes. Her reinforced biology processed the toxins like mild indigestion. She emerged in the laboratory's lower level, directly beneath their defensive position, and spent 6 minutes carefully placing breaching charges she'd manufactured from her own body chemistry. The explosion scattered them. She moved through the chaos like water flowing downhill, taking down targets with the efficiency of something purpose-built for killing because that's exactly what she was. The last researcher triggered an emergency beacon before dying, broadcasting its final moments across Yverath military channels. Command hadn't authorized that kind of psychological warfare, but her predator brain understood value when it calculated it. The third deployment was a supply convoy, 8 ships carrying reinforcements to one of their contested sectors. She boarded the flagship via exterior hull breach, worked her way through life support systems to the crew quarters, and left the bridge crew for last. They found her sitting in the captain's chair when they came to investigate why 17 decks had stopped responding. The captain tried to ram the ship into its nearest neighbor to kill her in the explosion. She was already gone, moving to the second ship. By the 5th ship, the convoy was broadcasting panic demands for extraction. By the 8th, they were simply screaming. She let one escape pod launch successfully. Survivors spread fear more effectively than bots. General Frost called her in for a tactical review after that incident, though calling it a review was generous, more like an intervention performed by a man who'd realized his weapon had developed opinions about target selection. "You're exceeding mission parameters," he said, pulling up casualty reports that read more like horror fiction. "Command sends you after specific targets. You're engaging entire installations. You're creating refugee situations. You're turning military operations into terror campaigns." She looked at him with eyes that didn't blink quite as often as human eyes should. The Yverath respond to fear more effectively than force. Their species evolved without natural predators. Threatening their extinction timeline doesn't affect their tactical decision. Threatening their personal survival does. "You're supposed to be a soldier, not a strategic policy advisor. I'm supposed to be whatever wins the war." Her voice came out flat, emotionless, stripped of the social niceties that had been pruned away during her transformation. The Yverath have begun withdrawing from 3 contested sectors. Their supply lines are disrupted because transport crews are refusing high-risk routes. Their combat efficiency has dropped by 14% in regions where I've operated. "You created me to be effective. Don't complain when I am." The general's jaw worked like he was chewing through several responses before finding one that wouldn't require immediate court-martial. "There are rules, conventions, things we don't do even in war because they make us no better than them." She considered this briefly, turning it over in her streamlined consciousness. The old her, the scientist who'd loved poetry and philosophy, might have agreed. The current her, the thing that had been built from that scientist's raw materials, found the concept tactically irrelevant. The Yverath orbital bombarded New Valletta. 15 billion civilians, no military targets. They did it because those civilians were logistically inconvenient. "You want me to observe conventions with a species that considers genocide an acceptable time-saving measure. I want you to remember you're human." "I'm not, though," she stated it matter-of-factly, without particular emotion. "We established that 11 days into the transformation, I'm what you made when you sacrificed my humanity to save humanity. You don't get to demand I maintain the comfortable fiction that those are compatible states." He dismissed her without further comment. She returned to her quarters, which had been specially constructed to contain something Command was no longer entirely certain they controlled. Reinforced walls, monitoring systems, guards positioned outside with weapons calibrated for targets with her specific biological signature. She found it practical rather than offensive. If their positions were reversed, she'd do the same thing. The deployments continued. A command station where she eliminated an entire strategic planning division. A manufacturing complex producing Yverath weapons systems, which she collapsed by systematically killing the engineering staff. A diplomatic vessel attempting to negotiate alliance with a neutral species, which she boarded and cleared deck by deck, leaving the diplomats for last so they could fully appreciate their situation before dying. Each mission refined her technique, her body adapted, learned, became more efficient. The toxins she synthesized grew more potent. Her camouflage capability improved. Her tactical analysis sharpened to the point where she could predict Yverath responses with disturbing accuracy. The human fragment that remained grew quieter, smaller, less relevant to her primary function. She'd stopped speaking in complete sentences around the 4th month. Language required processing power that could be better allocated to threat assessment. Communication happened through gesture, expression, the occasional word when absolutely necessary. The mission briefings became one-sided affairs where officers described targets, and she absorbed the information without comment or question. The Yverath networks buzzed with reports of her. They'd given her 17 different names in their language, each one translating roughly to variations of death, horror, the thing that shouldn't exist. Their military psychologists, yes, they had those apparently, wrote dissertations about the new human weapon, trying to categorize her, understand her, develop countermeasures. None of it worked because she wasn't a weapon system they could analyze. She was something that thought like they thought, hunted like they'd once hunted before becoming too successful, adapted faster than their protocols could account for. Every countermeasure they developed, she learned to circumvent. Every trap they set, she avoided or turned against. Every defense they erected, she found the weakness in. By month 6, Yverath forces had completely withdrawn from 9 formerly contested systems, not because humanity had defeated them militarily, because their soldiers refused to deploy to regions where she might be operating. Command efficiency had collapsed in sectors she'd visited. Officers were executing subordinates for refusing orders, which only made the problem worse. She watched the tactical reports with satisfaction. That was purely analytical. Fear was breaking their war machine more effectively than any conventional military campaign could have. They'd learned what it felt like to be prey. The problem, the one command hadn't anticipated and she hadn't cared enough to consider, was that she'd started enjoying it. Not in the way humans enjoyed pleasant experiences, in the way predators enjoyed successful hunts. Her brain produced biochemical rewards for killing, had been designed to do exactly that. And those rewards had begun restructuring what remained of her emotional capacity around that single purpose. She'd started taking trophies. Small things, claws, scales, pieces of armor she'd torn from bodies. Her quarters accumulated them, arranged in patterns that satisfied some aesthetic sense her predator brain had developed. Command noticed but didn't comment. Removing the trophies seemed like the kind of thing that might produce unpredictable responses from something they couldn't reliably control. General Frost called her in for another review at month 7. She knew before entering what he'd say. The war was turning. Yverath forces were retreating across multiple fronts. Peace negotiations were being quietly initiated through neutral channels. They'd reached the point where humanity might actually survive, which meant they didn't need her anymore. One final mission, Frost said, looking older than he had when this started, aged by the weight of decisions no human should have to make. The Yverath High Command wants proof of our capabilities before committing to peace terms. They need to see what you are, what you can do. Demonstration of force to prevent future conflicts. She understood immediately. They wanted her to terrify the Yverath so thoroughly that the memory would prevent any thought of renewed war. One last horror show to secure permanent peace. Where? She asked, her voice barely recognizable as human. Their capital ship, the Dominion's Pride, will get you inside. After that you're authorized for complete operational freedom. She smiled, and it was not a comforting expression. The Dominion's Pride was 15 kilometers of warship, home to 3,000 Yverath, including their entire war council, the collection of generals and admirals who'd orchestrated humanity's near extinction, with the casual efficiency of exterminators, addressing an infestation. Getting her inside required coordination between intelligence assets that humanity had thought compromised, bribed Yverath officers who'd decided survival outweighed loyalty, and one absolutely suicidal freighter captain, who flew her in packed inside a cargo container marked as medical supplies. She spent 6 hours in that container, motionless, breathing slowly, her enhanced biology easily handling the oxygen deprivation that would have killed her former self. The predator part of her mind used the time productively, reviewing ship schematics, planning approach vectors, calculating kill sequences. The human fragment, that tiny piece still aware of what she'd become, wondered distantly if there'd ever been a choice that didn't lead here. Probably not. The moment the Yverath decided humanity was inconvenient, this outcome became inevitable. Someone was always going to volunteer for the transformation. Someone was always going to become the monster. She'd just been the one who'd stepped forward. The container reached the medical bay without incident. Yverath security scanned it, found medical supplies and nothing organic large enough to be threatening, and authorized delivery. They'd calibrated their scanners for threats that matched their understanding of combat.
She'd been designed to exceed that understanding. She emerged after the bay cleared, moving through ventilation systems that her compressed form navigated easily. The ship thrummed with activity, 3,000 Yverath going about their functions, completely unaware that death was currently crawling through their life support infrastructure. She started in the lower decks, where maintenance crews worked in small groups, killing them quickly and hiding the bodies in spaces that wouldn't be checked for hours. Each death she made quieter than the last, learning the ship's rhythm, understanding its pattern. By the time Command realized something was wrong, she'd eliminated 47 crew members and positioned herself 3 decks below the War Council's conference chamber. The ship went to combat alert at hour 4. Klaxons blared, bulkheads sealed, security teams deployed with weapons designed to stop boarding parties and conventional threats. She watched them through access panels, observing their movements, noting their procedures. They were efficient, trained, competent. They were also hunting something they couldn't conceptualize. She killed the security teams when they came close, dragging bodies into maintenance shafts, continuing her advance toward the upper decks. The ship's command structure began fracturing as reports came in from different sections. Something was aboard. Something was killing crew members. Something they couldn't track, couldn't corner, couldn't stop. The War Council convened an emergency session to address the situation. 12 of the Dominion's highest-ranking military commanders gathered in one reinforced chamber, debating how to handle the breach. She listened to them through the ventilation system, her enhanced hearing picking apart their language, understanding their fear beneath the tactical posture. They knew what she was. Intelligence had briefed them on the human bioweapon, the thing their propaganda had taken to calling humanity's final abomination. They just never expected to encounter her personally. Nobody expects the extinction-level threat to show up in their conference room. She gave them 1 hour to understand exactly how thoroughly compromised their position was. Spent that hour systematically eliminating the security forces stationed outside the chamber, leaving bodies arranged in configurations designed for maximum psychological impact. Each death broadcast through the Council's monitoring systems, each loss reducing their defensive capability while demonstrating her complete control of the situation. When the security force outside the chamber reached 0, she entered through the ceiling, dropping into the center of their conference table with claws extended and toxins already synthesizing. 12 of the deadliest military commanders in Yverath history stared at her. She stared back with eyes that had long since stopped processing them as people and started calculating them as targets. The head of the War Council, a massive male whose scales bore the scars of 100 battles, made the mistake of reaching for his weapon. She removed his arm before the movement completed, her enhanced speed turning his draw into a tactical error that cost him 3 of his 4 major circulatory systems. "Peace negotiations," she said, her voice grinding out words her simplified consciousness barely remembered how to form. "Unconditional, immediate, where I work through every ship in your fleet the way I've worked through this one." One council member, braver or more stupid than the rest, attempted to signal for backup. She destroyed the communication panel, then looked at him with predatory patience. "Already dead. All of them. 317 security personnel. Eliminated over 4 hours. You were monitoring. You watched." The council members exchanged glances, their fear scent thick enough to taste. They'd built an empire on being apex predator. She'd just demonstrated that apex was a relative term subject to revision. "Humanity created one of me," she continued, each word requiring effort, as her streamlined brain struggled with linguistic complexity. "Imagine what we create if you give us reason to build more. Imagine fleets of us. Imagine thousands. Imagine never being safe anywhere, because something like me could be in your walls, your ships, your colonies, waiting." It was a bluff. Technically, the transformation had a 3% survival rate, and Command had barely managed to create her. But the Yverath didn't know that. All they knew was what stood in front of them. A biological impossibility that had carved through their finest ship like it was constructed from tissue paper. The head of the War Council, still bleeding from 3 severed circulatory systems, made the calculation that would save his species. Agreed. Unconditional surrender, full territorial withdrawal, reparations. Whatever terms prevent humanity from creating more of you. She should have felt satisfaction. The human part of her, buried beneath layers of predatory instinct, registered this as victory. The war would end. Humanity would survive. Billions of lives saved by one person's willingness to become something horrific. Instead, she felt nothing, except mild disappointment, that the hunt was ending. Command extracted her via the same route she'd entered, leaving the War Council alive to formalize the surrender, though the head counselor would need significant medical intervention to avoid bleeding out. The peace terms were signed within 48 hours. The Yverath withdrew from all contested systems within a week. Reparations began immediately. Enough resources to rebuild what they'd destroyed. Humanity celebrated. Parades happened on Earth, and the surviving colony. Victory speeches were delivered by politicians who'd spent the war in bunkers. Memorials were constructed for the billions who hadn't survived. The species exhaled collectively, relieved to have a future again. She watched the celebrations from her containment facility, a specially constructed installation on a moon nobody visited, surrounded by enough firepower to crack the satellite if she ever became a problem. Command couldn't contain. General Frost visited once. After the formal peace ceremonies concluded, he looked at her through reinforced viewing glass, studying what Project Chimera had created from a scientist who'd loved poetry. "You saved humanity," he said quietly. "Every person celebrating out there owes their existence to what you became." She tilted her head, processing this statement through a consciousness that no longer quite understood concepts like gratitude or sacrifice. "Yes," she agreed flatly. "We'll take care of you. Comfortable quarters, anything you need, within reason. You've earned that much. I know what I am." Her voice came out mechanical, stripped of inflection. "A weapon you can't destroy because you might need me again. A monster you keep in a box until the next threat requires unleashing. Don't pretend this is reward, it's storage." Frost's expression confirmed what she'd already calculated. They'd never let her return to society. She was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too fundamentally other. She'd saved humanity by becoming something humanity couldn't coexist with. The irony wasn't lost on her, even with her simplified emotional processing. She'd made a silent promise to end the war by becoming the cruelest predator in the galaxy. She'd succeeded completely. The Yverath would never threaten humanity again. Too terrified of provoking the creation of more bioweapons like her, she'd secured peace for her species through systematic application of horror. The cost was just everything she'd. Frost left eventually, uncomfortable with the silence that had replaced conversation. She remained in her cell, surrounded by trophies collected from the War Council, scales and claws arranged in patterns that satisfied her predator aesthetic. Her enhanced senses tracked small movements in the facility around her, catalogued guard rotations, noted structural weaknesses she'd never exploit, because her human fragments still remembered why she'd volunteered. Somewhere on Earth, children were growing up who'd never know war. Families were reuniting, civilization was rebuilding. The future was happening because she'd agreed to stop having one. She'd become exactly what the title promised. The thing that made a silent promise and kept it by becoming crueler than anything the galaxy had encountered. The Yverath had learned their lesson. Humanity had learned a different one about the price of survival, and she existed in between, neither fully human nor entirely monster. A weapon in a box that couldn't be fired but couldn't be unmade, waiting patiently for whatever came next, with the patience of something that had been engineered to hunt forever. The galaxy was safer for her existence. It just wasn't safer for her, which seemed, in her diminished capacity for irony, somehow appropriate.